Many lies have been presented to the world respecting Hitler's relationships with women under this alluring heading. It may be that before and during the First World War, he had sexual experiences with women. In December 1933, he contradicted my assertion, as already described, that Emily was an ugly name by observing, "Don't say that. Emily is a lovely name. It was the name of my first sweetheart." In 1917, during the First World War, Hitler is alleged to have deserted an 18-year-old French girl, whom he had made pregnant in France, and an illegitimate son, Jean-Marie Leray, is supposed to have been the result. The boy discovered from his mother, shortly before her death, the identity of his father, allegedly Adolf Hitler. Subsequently, he attempted to establish Hitler's paternity by genetic research at a Heidelberg Institute and elsewhere. As I have said, these two cases may be true, but it seems likely from the moment when he decided to become a politician that Hitler renounced such pleasures. For Hitler, gratification came from the ecstasy of the masses. He was erotic with the women by whom he surrounded himself, but never sexual. "My lover is Germany," he emphasized repeatedly. Perhaps the frequently rumoured missing testicle is also true. When Professor Kieleutner, the Munich urologist, returned to Henriette von Schirach, a book he had borrowed from her about the residences of well-known Munich townspeople, he told her that he had underlined in pencil the names of all the prominent people he had treated. When she read through and saw Hitler's name underlined, she asked him, "What did you treat Hitler for?" Kieleutner replied, "Hitler had only one testicle, but I was not able to help him because he was too old." This happened allegedly in the 1920s. It is possible that Hitler might have been mocked by a woman, which led to his abandoning all further sexual activities. Maser quotes Linne as saying that Hitler had perfectly normal genitalia, which Linne had seen on a picnic when both urinated against a tree. In my opinion, Maser puts these words in Ling's mouth in order to prove the possibility of the Hitler son. Undoubtedly, Hitler enjoyed the company of beautiful women and was inspired by them. He used eroticism, but not sex. Because of the great objective he had set himself, and to which he was totally committed, sexual gratification occurred mentally. Emil Maurice, Hitler's chauffeur, told me that whenever he drove Hitler to this or that town, he, Morris, had to search for girls for Hitler while he was engaged in conferences. Afterwards, he would sit down with them and converse. He paid them, but never requested services. The exception was Angelika Gelly-Raubal, the daughter of Hitler's half-sister, Angela Raubal. He loved this girl very much, but apparently did not have sex with her. Here I must correct an error in the book by Dr. Wagner, Hitler aus nächster Nähe, p. 98. In the apartment at U, Prinzregentenplatz 16, actually two apartments, left and right, the household was run from the outset by Frau Winter and not Frau Raubal. After moving from Tierstrasse, Hitler brought along his old landladies Frau Reich and her mother Frau Dux. Later, Gelly-Raubal occupied one of these rooms. According to Ada Klein, it is also incorrect for Dr. Wagner to have said that Hitler would not allow Gelly to perform on stage. Gelly did not want to take singing lessons. Finally, she allowed herself to be convinced by her uncle, who would have liked her to have become a Wagner opera singer. From 1929, this attractive, lusty girl was installed in Hitler's flat at Prinzregentenplatz 16. He pampered her and did everything he could for her out of fondness. Gailey was flattered that her famous uncle should be so devoted, but he controlled her every move and jealously fended off all her admirers. When she announced her intention to marry a painter from Linz, Hitler convinced Gailey's mother to impose a 1-year separation so that the couple should prove their love for each other. A letter from the painter, which I salvaged from Schaub's bonfire at the Berghof in 1945, contained the following extract. "Now your uncle, whose influence on your mother is well known, is attempting to manipulate her weakness with unlimited cynicism. Unfortunately, we are not able to respond to this repression until you reach your majority. He always puts obstructions in our path to block our mutual happiness, although he knows that we are made for each other. The year of separation that your mother has imposed on us will only bind us closer to each other inwardly. As I always make the effort to think and act honestly, I find it difficult to accept the existence of these faults in others. However, I can only explain your uncle's actions as being grounded in selfish motives towards yourself. He simply intends that one day you will belong to nobody but him. And at another place, your uncle continues to see you as the inexperienced child, and cannot understand that you have matured meanwhile and want to shape your own future. Your uncle has an overbearing personality. In his party, they all cower before him like slaves. I do not understand how, with his keen intelligence, he can deceive himself into believing that his obstinacy and theories about marriage can break our love and determination. He hopes that during this year of separation, he will change your mind, but how little he knows your soul. And in that he was surely right, for one day Gailey could stand the pressure no longer, and shot herself on the day of a quarrel with her uncle. During internment post-war, I got to know Frau Winter. She was discreet and tight-lipped, and thus enjoyed Hitler's confidence during the period between 1929 and 1945, when she was his housekeeper cook at Prinzregentenplatz 16. What she told me about Gailey Raubel, the daughter of Hitler's half-sister Angela Raubel, I found very interesting. This had nothing to do with any immorality between Hitler and Gailey, but of a platonic love saturated with jealousy. According to Frau Winter, Gailey, who wanted to study singing, was installed by Hitler in his apartment. He had a room converted for her there. Gailey accompanied him everywhere and was the only woman at his side on his visits to the theatre. During the Prinzregenten Theatre Festival in early 1930, a beautiful silver fox fur she was wearing caught my eye. During the tea hour in the staircase room at the WWII Palace, Hitler's thoughts very often turned to Gailey, and he needed to speak about her. One inferred distinctly that he was grooming her to be his wife. When concluding some anecdotes about Gailey, he said once, "There was only one woman I would have married." And for me, the sense of this declaration was unmistakable. I also understood now why he had watched over the activities of the beloved like a hawk. Frau Winter was firmly convinced that Gailey dreamed of marrying her uncle, for no other man was in a position to pamper her permanently in the manner to which she had become accustomed. After the war, the US archives declassified invoices for extravagant purchases of clothing made for Gailey, a sure reason why she was prepared to be submissive and allow Hitler to drive off all her other suitors. Frau Winter stated that the circumstances surrounding Gailey's suicide were as follows. Hitler asked Gailey, who was visiting her mother at Berchtesgaden, to come to Munich. After her arrival on the morning of 18th of September 1931, he had to go into town, but promised to return for lunch. He did not return until 4 that afternoon, when he informed her that he had to travel immediately to Nuremberg. Gailey was upset because she could have stayed with her mother at Berchtesgaden. She asked Hitler for permission to go to Vienna for a vocal test, which she had had planned for some time, but he refused outright. Thus they parted under a cloud. Gailey now went through Hitler's possessions and found items of correspondence. She told Frau Winter that she was intending to go to the cinema, but instead stayed in her room. When Frau Winter brought her breakfast next morning, there was no answer to her knock. Seeing the key in the lock on the other side of the door, she feared the worst and asked her husband to break in. There they found Gailey shot dead, lying on a chaise longue. After Gailey's death, Hitler was a completely changed man, and his supporters feared that he might also take his own life. Heinrich Hoffmann took a close interest in Hitler's well-being and succeeded in the next few months in bringing Hitler out of his self-imposed isolation. Gailey's suicide hit Hitler hard, and at this point he converted to vegetarianism. His memory of Gailey became a cult for Hitler. Her room at his Munich flat had to remain precisely in the condition it was at the moment of her death. Until the outbreak of war, he carried the key to the room on his person, and the room which Gelly used to occupy at Haus Wachenfeld remained permanently locked. When the structure was enlarged later into the Berghof, the part where Gelly's room was located was left untouched. All her clothes, toilet items, and whatever else had belonged to her remained in their place. He even refused Gelly's mother the return of mementos or letters. Towards the end of the war, Hitler gave Schaub the job of destroying Gelly's personal effects. Beside the photos, there was a bust of her. When I knew all this, and that Hitler came between the couple whenever a love relationship threatened to take solid form, and when I heard him say in the staircase room, "There was only one woman I would have married," there was no doubt for me but that Gelly had been this woman. In the staircase room, we asked Hitler once, "Why have you never married?" He replied, "I would not have made a good father, and I would consider it irresponsible to have founded a family if I had not been able to devote myself sufficiently to the wife. Moreover, I do not want children of my own. I find that the descendants of a genius mostly have it very difficult in the world. One expects them to have the same ability as their famous forebear, and do not forgive them for being average. Apart from that, they mostly turn out cretins." Hitler appears to have kept his love life platonic throughout, beginning with the blonde Stephanie in Linz, whom he worshipped from afar, then Maria Reiter, Ada Klein, Sigrid von Laffert, to the various female theatrical performers and artistes who were invited to be entertained in the Führer apartment at the Reich Chancellery in the first years after 1933. His admiration for famous actresses and dancers was sincere. At a premiere and on their birthdays, he would send valuable presents, and in wartime took great pleasure in having parcels of coffee and food delivered to them, relishing the letters of gratitude they sent him for the gifts. His custom of throwing a brilliant reception for the German art world every year had to be abandoned once war came. I remember, for example, the dancers, the Höpfner sisters, the film actress Jenny Hugo, Magda Goebbels, her sister-in-law Ello Quandt, Gretel Slezak, Leni Riefenstahl, Unity Mitford, and Eva Braun. Yes, even his relationship with Eva Braun was a facade. Hitler's personal photographer, Heinrich Hoffmann, was convinced that Hitler had nothing with Eva Braun. He went out with her, but when he began to find less time for her, while electioneering, she made some sly suicide attempts. These were successful, for Hitler as a politician could not afford a second suicide of a young woman in his close circle. I repeat, the only woman he loved and would later have married was his niece, Gelly Raubal. Eva Braun's calculations worked out. Hitler drew her increasingly into his life. This protected him against future suicide attempts, and was also a shield against all his other ardent female admirers. Eva. Braun confided to her hairdresser, statement by Klaus von Schirach, that Hitler never had sexual intercourse with her. Ada Klein said the same to Nelly Scholter, wife of Bormann's gynecologist Dr. Scholter, who was friendly with Hitler in the 1920s. There were never sexual intimacies between them, and Hitler exercised the same abstinence towards Gretel Slezak. Hitler saw Ada Klein for the first time at the refounding ceremony for the NSDAP at the Bürgerbräukeller on 27th February 1925. She was a very beautiful Gailey-type girl, and stood in a visible position on a stool listening to him speak, as did many others. Hitler noticed her and asked Emil Maurice, his chauffeur, to find out about her, but in this he was unsuccessful. Ada Klein worked for a small ethnic racist newspaper, Völkischer Kurier, from where Max Amann recruited her to the Völkischer Beobachter. As she was leaving the Schellingstrasse offices one day, she bumped into Hitler. He exclaimed, "Ah, here you are." Subsequently, they met frequently at party occasions. Once she was alone with him in the old Haus Wachenfeld on the Obersalzberg, where he prepared the coffee himself and discovered that Schaub had left the biscuit tin empty. On another occasion, he invited her to Emil Maurice's 2 rooms. Shortly after their arrival, Emil Maurice took his leave. The door to the second room was open, and Ada saw a bed in it. As she told me, there were never any intimacies. He told her that he could not marry, but also, "You make me more light-headed than when I add the strongest rum to my tea, and it was you who taught me how to kiss." Ada Klein's friendship with Hitler lasted 2 years, 1925-6. He called her Deli and wrote her a few short letters which she kept. When one of her nieces, the two pretty Epps girls, were revue dancers occasionally invited by Hitler to his flat on the Prinzregentenplatz, told him in 1936 that Ada was going to marry Dr. Walter Schulze, Hitler said, "Then Dr. Schulze has found himself a good comrade." Dr. Schulze was later head of the Department of Health at the Bavarian Interior Ministry. I met Ada Klein in 1930 on a gymnastics course on Munich's Karolinenplatz, which was frequented by many employees of the Brauners Haus and the Eher Verlag. After that, we lost contact, and it was not until the late 1970s that we met again. One day when she visited me in my apartment, I told her of my meeting at Easter 1979 with Jean-Marie Leray, who was hoping that I might recognise him as the illegitimate son of Hitler, sired during a sexual relationship during the First World War with French girl Charlotte Lobjoyce. As neither he nor I spoke the other's language, I was unable to make the identification for this and other reasons. While out walking with him in the Blumenau, when he went ahead of me, I think I saw a similarity to Hitler in the gait and posture, but it is easy to deceive oneself in such things. Gretel Slezak was the daughter of the renowned heroic tenor Leo Slezak, who even when old remained an inspiration. Hitler got to know his daughter at the Munich Gärtnerplatz Theatre, where she played the leading role of the sweet Viennese maiden in Goldene Meisterin. She exuded a magic so captivating that Hitler was blind to her having a Jewish grandparent. Here I must contradict Dr. Picker's assertion on Post-WWII 8 of Hitler's Tischgespräche, where he says that Hitler's convictions forced him at Christmas 1932 to break off his especially warm friendship with the much-loved Berlin singer Gretel Slezak. The contrary was the case. Hitler maintained his friendship with the charming singer, who had inherited the devastating humour of her father, even after he took power, and he looked forward to every meeting with her. Without his agreement, as a person of some Jewish racial heritage, she would never have obtained years of successive contracts at the Deutsche Oper in Berlin in the 1930s. In March 1938, on the Sunday before the annexation of Austria to the Reich, Hitler invited Gretel Slezak and myself to tea at his flat in the Radziwill Palace. In the so-called music room, used for film shows in the evenings at which, apart from the close staff, the SS Begleitkommando and the house personnel were also present, the tea table before the fireplace was crowded. Hitler enjoyed hearing about the interminable scandals from the performers' circles, and delighted in the stories which Gretel Slezak knew how to deliver, with just the right amount of charming malice. That Sunday nobody knew what Hitler had afoot for the coming week. I had no suspicion that he was on the edge of his seat waiting for the off with Austria, and, as I see now, he was doing what he could to bridge the time gap, i.e. suppress his impatience. The tea hour had already gone on far longer than scheduled, and since we could not remain forever at the fireplace, I asked Hitler if he would like to see my apartment, which I had been promising to show him for some time. He agreed immediately, and arrived during the evening with a manservant, who withdrew after handing me a bottle of Fackener. My apartment was located in the Reich Chancellery Park. In 1936, Hitler had commissioned Speer to build 2 houses in the English country house style on the park side of Hermann-Göring-Strasse. These were originally to have been occupied solely by members of the SS Begleitkommando and their families. Shortly before they were completed, it occurred to me how practical it would be if we secretaries could also live there. In accordance with Hitler's ruling, nobody should know anything he does not need to know, and if he does need to know, then at the last possible moment, trips out were always advised at very short notice. It always enraged me when I had to drive to my flat on the Savigny Platz, not only to fetch my trunk, but to pack it first, And so, one day after dictation, I asked Hitler if it would not be possible for his 3 female secretaries also to have a flat each on the Hermann Göring Strasse. He thought about this and said, "Yes, child, that would be good. I would always have you people with me." Speer was asked to call by with the architectural plans, and Hitler told him to include 3 apartments for his secretaries. When these were ready for occupation, Hitler instructed Schaub to make me an allowance of 3,000 RM to furnish them, and promised to pay a brief visit to see the final result. To return to that tea night. After leaving the Reich Chancellery, Gretel Slezak had driven quickly to her apartment on the Kurfürstendamm in order to dress for the evening. She arrived with 2 large 5-armed candelabras, which she placed strategically in the hope that the candlelight would have a magical effect on Hitler when he arrived. No effort was to be spared. Sitting next to him on the English sofa, she tried to stroke his hand, but he fended her off, gently saying, "Gretel, you know that I cannot allow that." Although I had discreetly left the room a few times, Hitler maintained his reserve, and a few hours later his manservant retrieved him intact. Gretel would not give up hope, and thought she might at least have a closer relationship with Hitler. She was playing the lead role of Catherine the Great at the Deutsche Oper in Berlin, and before her next performance, convinced of her ultimate victory over him, gave me a photograph of herself in costume with a message in a large, triumphant hand. Tinchen, her nickname for me. To my first lady at court, from her Gretel. Just before New Year 1939, she gave me a letter to forward to Hitler at the Berghof. What it said, I have no idea, but it would have done her courtship no good, whatever. After taking power, Hitler would never have committed himself to anybody in the theatre because the risk would have been too great. All of them would have used it to advance their careers. He was always careful to maintain discretion with regard to his position. Now, I would like to address the assertion that Hitler painted Gretel Slezak. In the 1920s, he produced no more watercolours, only architectural sketches. In 1932, when he is supposed to have painted Gretel Slezak, he was on the hunt for electoral support, and in a single day might have spoken at 3 different locations. He had neither the time for, nor interest in, painting, and in any case in the past had only turned out watercolours to survive. He had not found that necessary from 1919 onwards, when he was active in the Reichswehr, and was sent to report on the newly formed Deutsche Arbeiterpartei of Anton Drexler. From then on, his life was devoted to that party and politics. From 1935, Margrethe Slezak was my close friend. If Hitler had ever painted her, I would certainly have found out about it. Hitler's alleged letters to her are crude forgeries. Margrethe Slezak was a divorcee with a daughter. Hitler knew all about it. He was not so ignorant that he would have written to a divorced woman as Fräulein Slezak. In any case, he always called her Gretel and used the formal pronoun sie and not the familiar du when speaking to her. He never called her Chapel, little idiot, an obvious fabrication. I knew Hitler's erstwhile lady friend, Ada Klein. In the 1920s, she was a regular visitor to his flat in the Tierstrasse, and knew from these visits that Hitler had given up painting. She shared my opinion that he had never painted flowers, only buildings and landscapes. To suggest otherwise is an unprincipled deception. Few people knew anything about Eva Braun before the end of the Second World War. I first knew her in the summer of 1933 on the Obersalzberg. The daughter of a Munich teacher of commerce, she was employed upon completing her education as a salesgirl in Heinrich Hoffmann's photography business. Although outwardly soft, blonde and womanly, she had great energy and will, and to get her own way, she could be very persuasive if necessary. Eva Braun enjoyed sport, was a competent skier, outstanding swimmer, and a passionate dancer. Hitler never danced. Hitler met Eva Braun at Hoffmann's business establishment in 1929. She found him to be a very interesting man. His name was always in the newspapers. He had men to protect him, and he was driven about in a large Mercedes by a chauffeur. Her boss, Heinrich Hoffmann, forecast a great future for Hitler. 6 months after Geli Raubal's death in September 1931, Hitler's friends finally succeeded in rousing him from his lethargy. Heinrich Hoffmann took him to a cinema one day and, purely by chance, sat Hitler next to Eva Braun, whom Hitler had often invited to the ice rink when Geli was alive, where they sometimes ate ice cream together. He had met her afterwards now and again without having any serious interest in her. Eva Braun told her friends, however, that Hitler was enamoured of her, and she now spun her web. Hitler had no hint of her intentions and was therefore more than surprised when Heinrich Hoffmann informed him one day, in November 1932, that Eva Braun had attempted suicide because of him. Hoffmann was naturally very anxious to protect his commercial relationship with Hitler, and the first meeting between Hitler and Eva Braun after her suicide attempt was held at Hoffmann's house in the Wasserburger Straße. Marion Schönmann, who was there, told me in the 1960s of the manoeuvre. Heinrich Hoffmann's wife, Erna, had used makeup on Eva Braun upstairs so that she appeared to be in distress for Hitler's arrival. Success was guaranteed when Hitler saw Eva Braun, still pallid, coming slowly downstairs. Hitler was of the opinion that he had given her no cause for her action, but the fear that a second suicide by a young woman of his close acquaintance must cast its shadow across his political career disturbed him. With female cunning, Eva had realised that fact after Geli's suicide. Hitler was left with no choice but to concern himself more for Eva Braun, and henceforth he included her in his life and cared for her. She was subsequently an occasional guest at Obersalzberg, but never stayed at Haus Wachenfeld because of Frau Raubal's antagonism towards her. Initially, Hitler rented her an apartment on the Weidemeierstrasse, and some years later made her a gift of a small house and garden at Wasserburger Strasse 12. Frau Raubal, Hitler's half-sister and his housekeeper on the Berg, made no secret of her dislike for Eva Braun and would deliberately ignore her. If obliged to speak to her, she would address her only as Fräulein, without using her name. She was quite open about her feelings and once told Goering, "I envy you 2 things for my brother. The first is Frau Sonnemann, and the other Robert." I heard Goering reply, "If necessary, I would give up Robert, but never Frau Sonnemann." From the beginning, Eva Braun had an aversion to Goering, and particularly his wife, Emmy. In the second year of the war, Emmy Goering invited all the Berghof ladies to tea at her country house. The real reason was to subject Eva Braun to close scrutiny. Hitler intervened, and when all the women, Frau Brandt, Frau Morell, Frau Goering and we secretaries assembled, we found that Eva Braun and her sister had stayed away. At the 1935 Nuremberg rally, the wives of ministers and Gauleiters, Hitler's sister and Eva Braun, and their friends, sat on the tribune for guests of honour. Frau Raubal was of the opinion that Eva Braun had drawn attention to herself, and said so to Hitler in the hope that he would rid himself of her afterwards. This backfired, and Frau Raubal was ordered to leave the Berg together with all the other women who had made adverse comments about Eva Braun in the affair, and they were not invited to enjoy the hospitality at Haus Wachenfeld again for a considerable time. As previously mentioned, the first suicide attempt by Eva Braun had had the desired effect, and she was now integrated into Hitler's circle. Perhaps by now he had had enough of Geli's mother, and so used the campaign against Eva Braun, instigated by his half-sister, as an excuse to remove Frau Raubal from the Berg. It is suggested elsewhere that his half-sister, Angela Raubal, kept house for him for years in Munich and on the Obersalzberg. She was forced out when Bormann converted the Berghof. For a large house, appropriate to a head of state, she was no longer adequate. No further commentary is necessary. In 1936, Frau Raubal left Obersalzberg, and, her heart weakened by all the excitement, she took the cure at Bad Nauheim, where she met and married Professor Hamitsch of Dresden University. She rarely saw her half-brother again, and only officially on his birthdays. when she was forced to wait at the Hotel Kaiserhof like an outsider for one of the adjutants to convey her to the Reich Chancellery. From now on, Eva Braun's position was apparently assured. This was noticeable at Haus Wachenfeld, even if she did not appear at official functions. When Haus Wachenfeld was revamped into the Berghof in the summer of 1936, she moved into a room on the first floor of the annex adjoining Hitler's bedroom, while her sisters and friends who were always around her even had guest rooms at their disposal. She looked after their needs herself, but her gratitude was tangible if one accepted them wholeheartedly. Her friendships with women were very variable and generally short-lived. Like all other females in Hitler's circle, she was ignorant of politics. In the presence of women, Hitler avoided all political talk regarding ongoing or planned operations. Often one would hear Eva Braun complain, "I never know anything. Everything is kept secret from me." In her appraisals, particularly of artistes, she lacked objectivity. If a face did not fit well with her, that person's good qualities were irrelevant, he or she had to go. Eva changed her clothing a couple of times daily, employed a hairdresser, and always gave the impression of being well-groomed. Her wardrobe was always well stocked with clothing for materials testing. She had 2 Scotch Terriers, Stasi and Negus, which she often walked. She was keen on sport, practicing frequently. She also had a bullfinch which she taught a popular song by whistling to the bird through pursed lips. She liked listening to gramophone records, particularly the tragic songs of Mimi Thoma, reading periodicals and crime novels, and kept up to date about the latest film releases, and so filled her time well. All accounts which allege that Eva Braun was employed as a housekeeper and ran the Berghof outstandingly well have no foundation in fact. After Frau Raubal's departure, Frau Endres, Herr and Frau Döring, and later the Mittelstrassers were the competent housekeepers. For special receptions, at which Eva Braun never appeared, house manager Kannenberg and his wife Freda would travel down from the Führer apartment in Berlin to do the necessary in their expert, routine manner. When Hermann Fegelein, Waffen-SS liaison officer to Hitler at FHQ, was on duty for the first time at the Berghof, he asked Marion Schönmann how he could arrange to be invited for lunch. That was at the beginning of 1944, when he arrived in Obersalzberg with Himmler. Marion introduced Fegelein to Eva Braun, and he obtained his lunch invitation through her. After Fegelein had left the Berghof, she confided to Marion Schönmann that Fegelein had made a big impression on her, and added, "A few years ago, the boss said that if I fell in love one day with another man, then I should let him know, and he would release me." Now she said to Marion, "If I had known Fegelein 10 years ago, I would have asked the boss to let me go." But the problem was to be resolved in another way. After the failure of various efforts to marry off her younger sister Greta to men in Hitler's wider circle, e.g. to diplomat Hoyer, Huel, Adjutant Darges, Minister Wagner, Eva Braun now matched her sister with Fegelein. He was a recognised heroic figure for women. Greta Braun was, as one would say today, sexy, and Fegelein might have been thinking of the advantages of one day being Hitler's brother-in-law. Thus the marriage took place and was celebrated as a great occasion on the Obersalzberg and in the tea house on the Kehlstein. Eva said, "I would like this marriage to be as wonderful as if it were my own." And so it was. Eva expressed her gratitude thus, "I am so grateful to Fegelein for marrying my sister. Now I am somebody. I am the sister-in-law of Fegelein." Clearly she suffered from the anonymity to which she was condemned. She was never permitted to appear in public, but as Fegelein's sister-in-law, there was a basis for her presence in Hitler's circle, and she could now be close to the man who had won her heart. Against Hitler's wishes, Eva came to the Reich Chancellery in February 1945 and moved into her apartment next to Hitler's private rooms. She expressed the wish for music but had no gramophone. I lent her mine, which had been in the Vossstrasse bunker. While Hitler was attending his military conferences, we used to play records, drink champagne, and quite often dance with off-duty officers. Hermann Fegelein was frequently amongst those who danced with Eva Braun. Today I can recall clearly the unforgettable scene. After a dance, Fegelein would lift Eva chest high. At eye level, they would gaze at each other full of tenderness and loving. Eva was obviously strongly attracted to Fegelein. I am convinced that her feelings for him went well beyond those feelings for a brother-in-law, but I do not believe anything went on between them. Upon her arrival in Berlin in February 1945, she said to me, "I have come because I owe the boss for everything wonderful in my life." In my opinion, she remained faithful to him, although undoubtedly she and Fegelein had to struggle against the overwhelming feelings that attracted them mutually. A tragedy, for at this time and place, they were made for each other. The fact that Fegelein, after deserting his post at the Reich Chancellery in April 1945, rang Eva Braun there and urged her to leave the Reich Chancellery and come to him, supports my presumption and observations. What thoughts must have assailed her when it became known that Fegelein had been found with another woman at his flat? Her decision to die alongside Hitler was that much easier to take, knowing that Fegelein was dead, shot by firing squad on Hitler's order. The most amazing thing of all at this time was how normally things proceeded as the end of the Third Reich approached. In 1877, Maurizia Moritz Meyer bought the equestrian establishment and Steinhaus estate, together with all the summer pasture around the Kailstein mountain. She turned the Steinhaus into the first hotel on the Obersalzberg, under her proprietorship pension. Moritz became a much-visited resort for guests and convalescents. Rich people from the city arrived as a result, buying up old farms or building their own mountain retreats. Professor Karl von Linde, for example, purchased the so-called Baumgarten estate and laid a road, later called the Professor von Linde Weg, to the Hochlenser. The Berlin piano manufacturer Bechstein built a house there, and Dr. Seitz, a paediatrician, set up a sanatorium for children. A Buxtehude businessman, Herr Winter, had an all-weather alpine chalet built there. In the 1920s, Adolf Hitler and senior NSDAP men Hermann Esser and Christian Weber came often to the Obersalzberg because the hunted NSDAP fugitive Dietrich Eckart, Hitler's mentor, had found shelter there. It was through Christian Weber, who found lodgings for Eckart at the Bruckner House, that Hitler came to the Obersalzberg for the first time. He was fascinated by the scenery. Hitler told us the story at tea one day. One can read all about it in Heim's Monologe im Führerhauptquartier, since a stenographic note was kept. Dietrich Eckart introduced Hitler to many of the local inhabitants, including Frau Bechstein, with whose help he rented Haus Wachenfeld from Frau Winter of Buxtehude for 100 RM. The tenancy was put into the name of his half-sister, Angela Raubal, at first, and in 1927 he transferred it to his own name, before eventually purchasing the house outright from the executors of Frau Winter's estate in 1934. In August 1933, I was summoned by telephone to Obersalzberg unexpectedly. At the time, I was working with the liaison staff. I arrived at Haus Wachenfeld in the afternoon to be welcomed by Frau Raubal. She was a widow 6 years older than her half-brother. She had had 3 children by her marriage to a taxation official, Friedel and Gili, and a son, Leo, who taught in Linz. Frau Raubal ran the household for Hitler. She was capable, active, and a person who maintained discipline, often hitting the table with her fist impulsively at mealtimes to make a point. She was a figure who inspired respect. She controlled her staff with a rod of iron, and also felt responsible for ensuring the well-being of her half-brother, although he did not seem to want this particularly. In an obviously distressed state, she told me that Hitler had gone off on a car trip with the gentlemen of his staff and some ladies, and were overdue. Greatly worried that some accident had befallen them, she was apparently glad to see me, as it would help to take her mind off the matter. She volunteered to show me the ground floor rooms of the Bavarian shingle-roofed house. A wooden balcony decorated with bright geraniums encircled the structure. The living room was typically Bavarian. A green dresser with farming scenes, a commode and rustic chairs, a grandfather clock, and, on a corner table, statuettes of a farmer with canary and a Moorish dancer. Not very Bavarian, on the other hand, were the many cushions and rugs embroidered with the swastika and mountain blooms in all colours which lay everywhere in abundance, all presents from Hitler's female admirers. Frau Raubal had apparently not had the heart to throw out all this evidence of the love and affection which these handicrafts manifested, and only after the conversion work to the house and the departure of Frau Raubal in 1936 did they disappear. She took me to the glass veranda annexed to the employees' rooms. It was built by Munich architect Neumeier, together with the garage and terrace, in April 1933. Meals were taken in the glass veranda, she told me. During my stay, I was able to confirm what a careful housekeeper and outstanding cook Frau Raubal was. A real delicacy were the little apple pies she made, which was something new for me. Then she led me to the terrace and showed me the view over Berchtesgaden, which stretched out below in the valley to the north. To the right of it was the Salzburg region. Opposite the house was the very impressive site of the Watzmann, 2,715 metres, and Untersberg, today Ettenberg, this latter mountain being the seat of legend, the place where Barbarossa is said to be entombed, awaiting the day of his return, rather like King Arthur, the Hohe Girl, and the Steinernes Meer. Well-maintained paths led from the terrace to the lawn at the side of the house. There used to be a rock garden on the southern slope, with a number of paths crisscrossing it. At the foot of the northern rock wall was a weathered, elongated, low wooden annex fronted by a wooden gallery, decorated with a mass of red geraniums. The balustrade had supporting columns to the roof. It formed an enchanting, living contrast to the brooding, gloomy mountains to the south of the house. This single-storey structure adjoining Haus Wachenfeld had 5 rooms, a simple office, 3 guest rooms, and a large dormitory for the SS Begleitkommando. Later, 2 of the guest rooms were converted into a medical surgery and the surgery of Dr. Blaschke, Hitler's dentist. In the summer of 1933, all guests booked into the nearby pensions on the Obersalzberg. At the end of the elongated annex was the so-called adjutant's shack. A narrow wooden stairway on the outside at the front led up to 2 small rooms, a bedroom with bath, and an office for the duty adjutant. A telephone switchboard was located on the ground floor. At sunset, that day Frau Raubal and I stood on the terrace overlooking the road leading upwards, awaiting the return of the overdue excursionists. I could hear one of the maids, dressed in Tyrolean costume, setting the table for dinner in the glass veranda. Finally some cars came up the mountain, the small house filled with the voices of the arrivals, and a short time later Hitler's guests assembled in the veranda. Hitler and Frau Raubal occupied the table ends while the guests sat where they fancied. On that occasion, I remember Hitler's photographer Heinrich Hoffmann with his wife Erna, Hitler's long-term chauffeur SS Staffelführer Julius Schreck, and female friend, Reich press chief Dr. Otto Dietrich with his wife, Julius Schaub, Eva Braun, and Annie Rayborn. Of the last, Raylein, I would like to say something. In 1923 and 1924, she won the German swimming championships in the 100 metres crawl and backstroke. When the Berliner Illustrierte published her photograph on the title page, it was seen by Hitler's followers sharing his imprisonment at Landsberg. Hitler's chauffeur, Emil Maurice, was inspired to send Annie Rayborn his congratulations. After their release, a meeting took place at which Hitler was present, and at Christmas 1925 he sent her a copy of Mein Kampf, bound in red leather, with the inscription "To Fräulein Annie Rayborn, in sincere admiration," and encouraged her to visit whenever she was in Bavaria. She took him up on this offer frequently. In July 1933, while touring Germany in her small red Dixie car with her fiancé Dr. Karl Brandt, Hitler invited them both to stay for a few days on the Berg, where they were booked into one of the pensions as his guests, and came up to Haus Wachenfeld for lunch and dinner. One afternoon, a telephone message brought the news that Chief Adjutant Wilhelm Bruckner and his friend Sophie Storck had been badly injured in a road accident at Reich and had been taken to the hospital at Traunstein. Bruckner had fallen asleep at the wheel and collided with a stack of wood. How lucky he was to have had Dr. Brandt along as a passenger. Calmly and carefully, he took the initiative, did everything necessary to make the casualties comfortable, and carried out the operation himself at Traunstein Hospital. While Sophie Storck escaped with a broken arm, Bruckner was seriously hurt, sustaining a skull fracture and losing an eye. Goering, who was also a passenger, was so impressed by the skill of the young doctor that he exclaimed, "If ever I have to be operated on, then only by Dr. Brandt." Until then, Hitler had never had a medical aid on his various trips, but now he saw the necessity. It was therefore not surprising that he should ask the pleasant young Brandt if he would like to join his staff as Doctor Begleitarzt, and he agreed. A short while later, Brandt married Annie Rayborn. Both Hitler and Goering were guests at the wedding. The ability of Dr. Brandt was proverbial, as was his joviality. A doctor with the soul of a Paracelsus. To the last, his life was devoted to his calling. In the true sense of the term, he embraced the higher life, and let it embrace him too. He matured to a greatness in which he overshadowed the death sentence which awaited him at the end of the road. Brandt was the Führer's emergencies only doctor, but his role was actually only as a surgeon while Hitler was travelling. Otherwise, he worked at the Surgical University Clinic in Berlin's Ziegelstrasse, where Dr. Werner Haase and Dr. von Hasselbach also worked as surgeons and occasionally deputized for Brandt on journeys and when Hitler was at the Berg. At this time, Hitler and his guests used to go on short rambles. A favourite destination was the Hochlenzer, where they would sit in front of the small house on wooden benches in the sun and enjoy the glorious view to Königssee, which glittered in the distance. At Hochlenzer, a very refreshing curds and whey was scooped up and served in brown earthenware bowls. It was a rare delicacy. The milk was never moved until it curdled to prevent bubbles forming in the curd. Other walks went to Scharitzkale and the Vorderbrand. They were glorious little treks. Hitler would wear a bright blue corduroy jacket. In later years the walks were dropped, and after lunch he would venture no further than the small tea house on the Muslaner Kopf. In the 1930s Hitler would always spend Christmas on the Berg. Although after Gailey's suicide in 1931, Christmas was a difficult period for him and awkward for his guests. He would allow a tree to be erected in a corner of the Great Hall, but no carols were sung. New Year, on the other hand, was celebrated in the traditional manner. The meals were festive, and everybody was served sparkling wine. At the stroke of midnight, Hitler would touch glasses with his guest and sip, though he always pulled a face as he did so, for he could not understand how a person could take pleasure in drinking vinegar water. He would then lead his guest to the terrace to watch the fireworks display at Berchtesgaden. Afterwards, he would autograph the table cards of all his guests, and a group photo would be taken before the fireplace.